He's known as the artist who faked his own death, embalmed the body of a tramp, slept with thousands of women.
Robert Lenkiewicz, born in 1941 to two Holocaust refugees, grew up in the Hotel Shemtov in London, owned by his parents. The hotel served as a home for many Jewish immigrants and other unconventional characters.
The hotel, it was a large house. There was room for no more than 20 people, although Robert often says 60.
What he described as rabbis and insane people.
Robert had a way of dramatising certain things sometimes. When he says there were 60 half-crazed Holocaust survivors, I have no recollection of that at all. My recollection of my mother was that for sure she was, you could say, hysterical, and she used to scream a lot. Robert was definitely her favourite. It wouldn't be going too far to say that she was in love with him, which I think filled Robert with some revulsion. Possibly the reason is that he was talented at painting, and her father was a painter. He died when my mother was 7 years old, so that must have had a huge impact on her in terms of her attachment.
It was unclear why he left London, whether it was due to unpaid debts or his aversion towards the London art scene. Robert made the move to Devon with his first wife Mouse. He finally settled in the historical city of Plymouth in 1969, where he then opened the Portrait Painter at number 25 The Parade, situated in the Barbican.
Well, Robert was very charming. Everyone found him so. He seemed as if he gave people his fullest attention, as if they were the only person in the world.
I think people were a bit wary at first, but he was very charismatic. He had a very engaging personality, and when he spoke to you, he spoke to you. Yeah, there's nobody else in the room.
Also a man who had the capacity to make you feel as though you were the most important person in the world, at least for the moment when he was talking to you.
He came across as an extraordinarily sociable, likeable individual. He engaged with everyone, a bit like, as they describe, I think, Clinton, that when Clinton spoke to someone in a room, you felt almost as though you were the only person in that room.
I think at first there were people that didn't take to the stuff that he did with tramps, and his themes were interesting, usually.
He could have worn a British Home Store suit. It would have had a slightly different energy. The clothes he wore and his manner made him unquestionably an outsider. I think he chose to live a life outside of the conventional because he could, and I think some of it was probably quite manufactured at the beginning. For example, the creak in his studio door was designed to creak, be part of, you know, the mystery of the man.
People came to recognise him, which wasn't difficult because the hair, the red scarf, the black kind of cape and the trousers and the big boots.
He was often seen as a kind of an iconoclastic figure, tall, impressive individual, flowing cloak, large boots, flowing hair. So he looked the classic part of a high Renaissance painter.
He started associating with dossers and bringing them back to stay, and he was very motivated to accommodate homeless people.
He was spending a lot of his time in the company of down and outs, that's people addicted to alcohol, drug addicts and so on.
At the time, the city of Plymouth denied that there was a problem with vagrancy and homelessness in the city, and he found a lot of homeless people to disprove that. I think that he was, in the nicest possible way, an incredibly talented manipulator. And the thing I discovered mostly, I suppose, is that he was a man who compartmentalized his life, so very few people got to know the whole picture.
Robert's projects, which were described as sociological investigations by visual means, were both controversial and highly valued. Suicide, death and addictive behaviour were just a few of the social subjects he explored.
I remember at the hotel even, he was very interested in the philosophy of Nietzsche and Schopenhauer. He was introduced to the names by my mother, who was not academic.
The overriding purpose, if you like, that he wanted to put his work to was to try and display the tragedy of the human condition. The first project, which was on vagrancy, clearly relates to the tragic condition of people whose lives become enslaved to alcohol or drugs. And then we had a whole series of relationships to do with love, you know, the cravings that we have towards other people. Other tragic conditions were explored in the project of old age, suicide and death.
He was fascinated by the world around him and unafraid to look at subjects where lesser mortals would fear to tread.
All of his projects had a kind of sociological and philosophical purpose.
I think in many ways Robert was more of a philosopher than a lot of so-called professional philosophers.
Whenever he painted somebody, he would invariably make long notes about it.
Lenkiewicz explored sexual behaviour and love with an underlying philosophical basis, both in his art projects and in his personal life.
As far as women are concerned, well, his relationships are legendary. He used to say that he had had relationships with some thousands of women.
He also believed that the whole nature of addiction could be applied to every aspect of life, including falling in love. At different times in his life, he was overwhelmed by different individuals. This is the thing, not exclusively.
He described himself as a sort of prowler in the night.
He was a master at seduction. He was able to seduce anybody verbally, you know, and obviously in other ways as well.
Robert came to see love for another person as simply as a personal, selfish craving.
I remember him saying to me once that he would get into situations with women and he would occasionally engineer things so that he would feel that yearning, that longing that people would recognise as being in love. He explored sex from a practical point of view.
By 1981, Lenkiewicz was quite the local celebrity and had built up a respectable reputation as a truly talented painter and an outlandish character. So when people heard of his early death, they were shocked.
He explored death by trying to die once through this fake death. He felt it was the closest he could get to the experience of being dead, which is to be thought of as being dead.
He didn't think it would turn into a big deal. He thought there'd be just a couple of lines somewhere and he could experience what it was like to be thought dead.
When it was read by the media, really all hell broke loose.
He didn't realise that the story would be taken up and it would be turned into a big deal and that there would be a kind of anger when he reappeared like Lazarus.
Journalists follow you in the street, ringing your doorbell, ringing the phone, and then we had a visit from the police and they wanted to know where was the body. And the body was safely ensconced at Port Eliot.
Robert, for much of his life, just couldn't stop himself. You know, if he had an idea and had the capacity to piss people off.
When it was revealed as being a ruse, the leader of the council was extremely angry.
The subject of death led Lenkiewicz to explore it through his paintings and projects. But controversy surrounded Robert when in 1985 he had the dead body of his friend and vagrant embalmed.
I think he'd got signed permission from Diogenes to be able to do all this. Death always intrigued Robert, and more than most was keen to look into it.
It was very well embalmed, very professionally embalmed. He kept the body 4 years, as we know, and it was only after he died that it was found in the library.
Plymouth was Robert Lenkiewicz's final home, and his impact on the cultural city was significant.
He was a bit of a Robin Hood in some respects, in that He would steal from the rich. He would deny paying the rich in order to fund the poor.
Robert would never have said that he was doing it for charity reasons, but he would have regarded that as perhaps sentimental.
He obviously had quite a big effect in his lifetime because one or two of the galleries would sell his prints and limited edition prints, and they'd do quite nicely out of it, and Robert became quite an industry.
His presence on the Barbican, for example, was largely responsible for how many art galleries have opened.
The first big mural that he did attracted huge numbers of people, and it's still a very popular picture postcard now.
For almost 40 years, Robert brought culture and excitement to the city and was dedicated to making Plymouth a key cultural city.
He certainly attracted a lot of tourism, and a lot of people became would come down to the Barbican specifically to see his works.
There's been lots of artists on the Barbican, but they certainly haven't been controversial in the way that Robert was. Nobody had the ability that Robert had. Nobody was as articulate as Robert. Nobody went round and had people look and say, oh, that's Robert Lenkiewicz, you know.
Also, what is the history of Plymouth in terms of art? Who is there in the last 200 years apart from Robert? In terms of that level of skill and that level of productivity and that level of intellectual backup of the work, I don't think there's anybody.
He became an extremely good portrait painter, a brilliant craftsman, could capture skin tones and light, second to none practicing in the country at the moment, I think.
When I look at the work, I am absolutely astonished by the talent, the level of detail that he painted regularly.
There I was looking at myself. It was almost like looking at myself in the mirror, and I thought, that's it, so we're done. He said, oh, no, we're not nearly done yet. I used to go back at least once a month for nearly 3 years because he said, we've got to get the paint texture right, otherwise it just looks flat.
Robert Lenkiewicz had undeniable talent and painted with intuitive and remarkable skill, never describing himself as an artist, but a painter.
He produced some incredibly rich and beautiful works. When you look at the best of his work, you can see that there is a really incredible talent, a kind of academic portrait painter.
And it was always about taking a radical position, trying to get people to look at things in a new and exciting way. It seems strange in a way, taking a very radical approach to issues, because he painted in a very conventional classical style.
I never heard him say anything suggesting that his work was as great as onlookers would assess it as being.
He was addicted to books.
I think his overriding passion was the collection of books.
He was heavily addicted, he was a bibliophile and heavily addicted to books, antiquarian books.
He was collecting a very, very worthy library.
And so in the library we have the 5,000 books on philosophy, 1,000 books on Third Reich and Holocaust, and then we have 4,500 books on the art history.
My wife and I were abroad in the summer of 2002 when my son phoned me to say that it had been announced that Robert had died. And that was a great shock, really. It did seem as though Plymouth cultural horizon had a big hole left in it when Robert died.
He touched the lives of tens of thousands of people.
He was able to achieve more than almost anyone I'd ever known.
Robert was an inspiring figure to know, showing me that it doesn't matter what other people think of you, and that it's important to create your life, the life that you want, and to live it as best as you can, because the other thing that he was constantly aware of was death, and he used to say that we are no more important than a blade of grass.